I thought I knew my wife better than anyone, until one night, I overheard a conversation in our kitchen that changed everything. What I uncovered wasn't just infidelity, it was a tangled web of secrets involving her and her sisters that shattered my entire world. You might think I'm the biggest fool, the blindest husband to have ever walked this earth. And, in some ways, you'd be right. Hindsight has a way of making even the smartest person feel like an idiot. But in my defense, I wasn't just blind, I was in love. Deeply, wholeheartedly, and maybe naively. I trusted my wife, as most happily married men do. I couldn't have imagined that the woman I cherished for 8 years, the woman I shared my life, my dreams, and countless precious moments with, could turn out to be so selfish. A part of me still struggles with this realization, but the truth is undeniable now. The story doesn't begin with Molly alone. It includes her 2 sisters. Identical triplets, in fact. From the very first date, Molly's sisters became a curious and slightly intimidating part of my world. I had never encountered triplets before, let alone ones so strikingly beautiful. Seeing 3 women who looked so alike, yet each with her own subtle distinctions, was both thrilling and, admittedly, a bit surreal. I met Molly in the most ordinary of places, a grocery store. It was in the tea aisle, where she stood on her tiptoes, struggling to reach a box of herbal tea. Molly, standing at just under 5 feet tall, with her petite yet curvy frame and short jet black hair, turned to me for help. At 6 feet 0 inches, I was the natural choice. I handed her the tea, and we exchanged a polite smile. That moment could have been just that, a fleeting, inconsequential interaction. But Molly had other plans. It wasn't until our 4th date that she confessed the truth. She'd seen me earlier in the produce section, thought I was cute, and deliberately lingered in the tea aisle, waiting for me to come close enough for her to ask for help. She told me this while lying in my arms, her head nestled on my chest, moments after we'd made love for the first time. It was both flattering and heartwarming, a memory that, for a long time, I treasured deeply. Our first few dates felt like they were straight out of a rom-com. We had dinner and lost track of time talking until nearly midnight. We walked through the park, feeding ducks as though we were in a painting. And yes, we even went to a cheesy romantic movie and held hands the entire time. Corny? Maybe. But to me, it was magical. I was captivated by Molly, her beauty, her laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she smiled. She wasn't just a woman I was dating. She felt like the dream I never dared to wish for. Molly was the kind of beautiful that felt approachable, sexy in the most genuine, girl-next-door kind of way. Her smile was warm and disarming, the sort of smile that could melt the heart of even the most hardened IRS auditor. After I handed her the tea box, she struck up a casual conversation, steering it effortlessly. It was one of those moments where you think you're the one driving the interaction, but in truth, she had me wrapped around her finger from the start. When I left the store that day with her number and a date set for the following Friday, I felt like I had just won the lottery. She'd mentioned something about having sisters during one of our early conversations, but she'd been vague. Nothing could have prepared me for what greeted me when I arrived to pick her up for our date, a trio of stunningly identical Mollys. When the front door opened, I was momentarily speechless. The woman who greeted me looked exactly like Molly, but before I could get a word out, she smiled and said, "Hi. You must be Scott." I stammered, utterly confused. You aren't Molly?" Her laugh was just as charming as Molly's had been when we met. "No, I'm Hannah. Molly, Amy, and I are triplets. Didn't she mention us?" I felt my face flush. She might have said something about sisters, but twins weren't mentioned." Hannah laughed again, a sound that immediately put me at ease. "Yeah, Molly does that sometimes. She likes to have a little fun at other people's expense. Come on in, I'll go get her." I stepped inside, still processing this unexpected revelation. As I looked around the living room, I spotted another Molly, or so I thought. This one smiled at me from the couch, the same dazzling smile I'd seen at the grocery store. But, of course, it wasn't Molly. It was Amy. They all had the same short jet black hair, the same petite yet curvy figures, and the same brilliant, heart-stopping smiles. There was no way I could tell them apart, at least, not until Molly finally emerged from one of the bedrooms, grinning at my bewildered expression. "Hi, Scott," she said playfully. "Would you like a nice cup of herbal tea?" It broke the tension, and I couldn't help but laugh. "I think I'm going to need it to process all this," I joked, still marveling at the uncanny resemblance between the three of them. During our first dinner that night, we talked about everything under the sun. But the conversation kept circling back to Molly's life as a triplet. I was fascinated and couldn't stop asking questions. What's it like to see your face on two other people every day? Are you closer than regular siblings? Can you read each other's minds like some twins claim they can? And, come on, have you ever switched places to fool someone? Molly laughed, shaking her head. "I don't know about reading each other's minds," she said thoughtfully, "but we're definitely closer than most siblings. We've had the same experiences, the same friends growing up. It's like having two extra versions of yourself who always have your back." Her answers were earnest and sweet, and I found myself falling for her even more. I couldn't help but think how lucky I was to have stumbled upon her, and to be welcomed into this unique, slightly surreal world of hers. "I feel like I almost always know what Amy or Hannah is thinking," Molly said with a thoughtful smile. "And they seem to have the same sense about me. It's uncanny sometimes. Like, they'll answer a question I haven't even asked yet, or finish my thoughts for me. We've always been this way, it's just part of who we are as triplets." She paused for a moment, then smiled mischievously. "As for fooling people, well, I guess we've done that a little bit. Have you noticed that we all have the same hairstyle?" I nodded, intrigued. "When we were little, we loved tricking people," she admitted, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Our teachers, relatives, even our parents sometimes, they couldn't tell us apart. We thought it was hilarious, especially when one of us got into trouble and wanted to avoid a spanking. No, Dad, I'm not Amy, I'm Molly." She laughed at the memory. You can imagine how crazy that must have driven our parents. I laughed along with her, picturing the chaos three identical little girls must have caused. That must have been quite a handful for them. "Oh, definitely," she said, her grin widening. "But things changed in high school. That was when we all wanted to assert our individuality. For a while, we hated being mistaken for each other. It was frustrating. So, we decided to make it easier for everyone by doing our own thing. We each wore different hairstyles, took separate classes, and even joined completely different activities. I worked on the yearbook staff, Amy wrote for the school newspaper, and Hannah played field hockey." "That must have helped," I said. "It did," she agreed. "But after a few years, we started to miss the connection that came with being interchangeable. It was like we realized that our bond, this thing that made us unique, was something we didn't want to lose. So, we went back to looking the same. The haircuts, the clothes, it all became part of who we were again." Her voice grew playful as she leaned in. "And every now and then, we'd take advantage of it. Like, I might take a chemistry test for Amy, or Hannah would handle an oral presentation for me. It wasn't exactly honest, but it sure helped all of us out when it came to our grades." She grinned again, and I couldn't help but be charmed by the mix of nostalgia and mischief in her tone. Then she added, "Oh, and there was this one time when Brad Hendrick, he was the big crush of junior year, asked Amy out on a date. She was over the moon about it. But the morning of the date, she came down with the flu. Poor Amy was devastated. She was convinced he'd never ask her out again if she cancelled." Molly paused for dramatic effect, her grin turning sly. "So, I went on the date for her." "You're kidding," I said, laughing. "Nope. I pulled it off, too." Brad had no idea, she said with a wink. And don't worry, we kept it strictly platonic. I made sure to tell Amy every detail afterward so she wouldn't miss a thing. You really did that for her? I asked, shaking my head in amazement. Of course, she said softly. That's the thing about being a triplet. We've always got each other's backs, no matter what. At the time, I was working at a small but busy graphic design firm in the city. Despite being one of the younger employees, my computer skills were far ahead of the older guys who ran the place. They relied on me to keep things running smoothly, which made me a valuable asset. As a result, I earned a good salary. Molly and I were able to afford a lovely 3-bedroom house in Oakley Square, just a short drive from downtown. It was the kind of place where life felt comfortable, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and plenty of space for the life we were building together. Speaking of neighbors, I don't think you'll be shocked to learn who lived nearby. 3 years after Molly and I tied the knot, her sister Amy got married. Her husband, Ted, was a tall, well-meaning guy who worked in finance. He wasn't the most exciting person in the world, but he was friendly and kind. It turned out that Ted and Amy moved into a house just down the street, making our already close-knit family even closer. Evenings in Oakley Square became something of a routine. Around 9:30 or 10 p.m., it wasn't uncommon for Molly and her sisters to meet up in one of our homes to chat before heading back to their respective husbands. It was a ritual that seemed to strengthen their bond, and I didn't mind, though, I'll admit, even after 8 years of marriage, I still found it difficult to tell the triplets apart at times. Ted and Ari, Hannah's husband, admitted they had the same problem. We'd all become adept at noticing which sister wore what, a specific pair of earrings, a necklace, or even a certain outfit. That's how we navigated the challenge of living among 3 identical women who delighted in their shared resemblance. The close relationship extended to Molly's parents, Pam and Donald. Every Christmas, we'd celebrate together as one big family, enjoying their warm hospitality. Summers were no exception either. For 2 weeks each year, the 6 of us, Molly, me, her sisters, and their husbands, would take a trip somewhere fun and exciting. Some years, we'd head to Las Vegas, other times, we'd lounge on the beaches of North Carolina. One particularly memorable year, we even ventured to Italy. We were a fairly compatible group, and the husbands didn't mind the arrangement, most of the time. However, I had one non-negotiable rule: every year, I insisted on taking a week-long vacation with just Molly. No sisters. No brothers-in-law. Just the 2 of us. At first, this proposal wasn't well received. Molly resisted, and her sisters weren't thrilled about the idea either. Heated arguments and icy silences became a regular part of the conversation whenever I brought it up. But I stood firm, refusing to back down. I believed that time alone was essential for our marriage. Eventually, Molly realized I wasn't budging, and we booked a trip to Italy for just the 2 of us. I wish I could say it was a smooth experience, but the first few days were undeniably frosty. Molly's irritation was palpable, and her sisters weren't shy about letting me know I was in the doghouse. Thankfully, I wasn't completely alone in this battle. Ted and Ari secretly encouraged me, celebrating my small victory. They knew that if Molly and I set the precedent, they could follow suit, convincing Amy and Hannah to embrace the idea of one-on-one trips as well. By the end of our Italian getaway, the tension had melted away. Molly admitted she had enjoyed the uninterrupted time together, and our relationship felt stronger for it. Little by little, the sisters warmed to the idea of these individual vacations, though they never stopped teasing me about my stubbornness. And honestly, I didn't mind. Those weeks away were worth every moment of negotiation. At one point during our trip to Florence, I nearly gave up and considered flying home early. The tension between Molly and me was so thick it felt almost unbearable. But by the 5th day, something changed. The romance and beauty of Florence began to work its magic on her, and her icy demeanor thawed. From that point on, the trip was incredible. We wandered through the winding streets hand in hand, soaked up the stunning art and architecture, and enjoyed long, intimate dinners under the Tuscan sky. It reminded me of our earlier days, when everything felt new and exciting. What really surprised me was how much Molly's mood shifted in the evenings. She would come to bed unusually passionate, more assertive than usual, and we'd find ourselves making love several times a night. It was thrilling and unexpected, like a spark reigniting in our marriage. It wasn't uncommon for us to share moments like these when the mood struck. On special occasions like birthdays or anniversaries, champagne always seemed to heighten her excitement, though most of the time our intimacy was softer and more tender, which suited me just fine. One evening, after one of her more passionate advances, I made a light-hearted comment in bed, jokingly calling her aggressive. I meant it as a playful remark, but it clearly didn't land the way I intended. Her expression turned serious. "Scott, that's not funny," she said, her tone colder than I'd expected. I chuckled nervously, unsure why she was upset, but she wasn't laughing. Later that week, another misunderstanding seemed to fan the flames of her frustration. It was a Saturday evening, and I had just returned from the grocery store with bags of food for dinner. Molly greeted me not with her usual warmth but with a glare that chilled the room. I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong. "Scott, this is not funny," she said, her voice sharp. "How could you think for even a second that I would do something like that?" Confused, I tried to lighten the mood. "Molly, what are you talking about?" "I was just joking." "Do you really think I'd ever share you with my sisters?" she snapped. Her eyes flashed with anger, and I could tell she wasn't in the mood for humor. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Earlier that day, during a playful moment, I had joked about the triplets being indistinguishable and teased her about what might happen if someone ever got us mixed up. At the time, she had laughed it off, or so I thought. But clearly, it had bothered her more than she let on. "Molly, forgive me," I said sincerely, reaching out to her. "I was only joking, honey. I didn't mean to upset you." She pulled away from my embrace and stood up, still visibly angry. "I'm going to take a shower," she said curtly, disappearing into the bathroom and locking the door behind her. I stood there, stunned, kicking myself for not recognizing how sensitive the subject might be. Later, when she finally came out of the bathroom, the tension had lessened, though the air between us still felt heavy. Trying to make amends, I wrapped my arms around her and said, "You know, Molly, even if Amy or Hannah tried to take me, I don't think they'd want me. You've told them I snore, right? I'm pretty sure that's a deal-breaker." To my relief, she cracked a smile. "Rats," I added playfully. "Guess I'll just have to stick with you." Her laughter was soft, but it was enough to break the ice. "Good," she said. "Because you're not going anywhere." I thought that was the end of it. Her mood lightened, and we moved on. Or so I believed. Little did I know, those moments would resurface years later in ways I could never have imagined. Later, I learned to tread carefully around certain jokes, especially ones about her sisters. Molly wasn't always forgiving, and there were moments when a casual remark could set her off entirely. As I mentioned before, it was the topic of starting a family, or more specifically, our struggle to have a child, that eventually overshadowed everything else. It consumed our thoughts and conversations, and any lingering tension from old jokes seemed to fade into the background. That evening began innocently enough. Over dinner, Molly and I had a long conversation about local politics in Cincinnati, an unusual but engaging topic that carried us through most of the meal. By the time we finished, the earlier tension seemed forgotten, and I thought little of it. The subject of our ongoing fertility struggles, something that had been weighing heavily on my mind, didn't resurface until much later that night. Molly and her sisters had their usual evening gathering in our kitchen, a tradition they maintained almost religiously. I stayed upstairs, watching a basketball game on TV, before heading to bed. It wasn't uncommon for me to fall asleep before Molly came up for the night. But just as I was about to drift off, the news from my recent doctor's visit about my sperm count came rushing back to me. It felt urgent, something I needed to share with Molly right away. I grabbed my robe and quietly made my way downstairs, intending to interrupt the sisters' meeting. As I approached the kitchen, though, I stopped in my tracks. Their voices carried softly through the air, and before I could step into the room, a snippet of their conversation froze me in place. "She sleeps with him more nights every week than any of us, plus the weekend," one voice said, tinged with a mix of laughter and exasperation. Another voice chimed in. "So, you probably shouldn't complain about your situation." There was more laughter, light, almost casual, but it left me feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. At first, I thought I'd misheard. Surely, they couldn't mean what I thought they did. But as I stood there, still and silent, their words became more and more condemning. "Honestly," said another voice, "I just don't think Scott can do the job." My heart stopped. It had to be Molly speaking. Who else would have reason to comment on my abilities? A sickening realization began to creep over me. This wasn't just idle gossip, it was something far darker, far more intimate. I carefully eased into a chair just out of sight, trying to steady my breathing and make sense of what I was hearing. I couldn't bring myself to interrupt, but I also couldn't pull myself away. Their laughter, their casual tone, it all felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. My mind raced, trying to piece together the implications of their conversation. Were they trading partners? Sharing each other's husbands? Unable to take any more, I crept back upstairs. My body felt heavy, as though every step required an immense effort. Once I returned to bed, I slid under the covers and lay completely still, staring at the ceiling. I needed to think, to process, to understand. There was no way I could confront Molly, not yet. Not without understanding the full scope of what I'd just overheard. And anyway, there was a lingering question in my mind: who, exactly, would be climbing into bed with me tonight? Minutes later, the bedroom door opened softly, and I heard the familiar rustle of someone slipping into the room. The mattress dipped slightly as one of the triplets slid into bed. She leaned over and kissed my cheek gently before whispering, "Good night, love." Her voice was soft, tender, unmistakably Molly's. I lay there, feigning sleep, unsure of how to respond or even how to feel. Part of me wanted to turn and hold her, to ask what the hell was going on downstairs. But the other part of me, the part that felt shattered, kept me frozen in place. I didn't know what was real anymore. And in that moment, the only thing I could do was pretend everything was fine. As Molly leaned in closer and whispered, "I love you, baby," I found myself doubting everything. Could it really still be Molly next to me? After all, the six of us, Molly, her sisters, and their husbands, had such a tightly intertwined routine. Most weekends, we hosted or attended a barbecue, brunch, or some other get-together. On the weekends we didn't, there always seemed to be a reason for someone to stop by, a quick trip to drop something off, pick something up, or invent some other pretext for visiting. It kept our lives busy, chaotic even, but in hindsight, it also created the perfect cover. Figuring out how the deception worked wasn't difficult. The logistics were seamless. But the real question, the one that haunted me, was why? Why would Molly, or her sisters, engage in something so absurdly risky and complicated? And why had I, or the other husbands, never noticed? Surely, you'd think a man could tell his own wife apart from another woman. Couldn't he? But here's the uncomfortable truth: we had no reason to be suspicious. There were no doubts, no signs. The trust we had in our wives was absolute. And the stronger that trust, the less likely we were to notice small inconsistencies, something said out of character, a moment forgotten, or a detail misplaced. These were things we dismissed as human error, never suspecting they might be something more. That night, after Molly had fallen asleep, I found myself unable to let it go. I needed to know, once and for all, whether the woman in my bed was actually her. Quietly, I slipped out of the bedroom and headed to the office. There, I found the ink pad we kept for stamping our checks. My heart raced as I dabbed a small amount of permanent black ink onto the tip of my finger. Returning to the bedroom, I carefully rolled back the covers and, with steady hands, made a tiny mark on her back. It was just above her shoulder blade, no bigger than a pencil eraser. My heart pounded as I stepped back, ensuring the mark was inconspicuous before slipping back into bed beside her. The next morning passed uneventfully. Molly, or whoever was pretending to be her, moved through her morning routine as usual. I acted as if nothing had happened, but inside, I was filled with nervous anticipation. Later that day, the 6 of us gathered for our usual barbecue. While I worked on the grill, I pulled Ari aside, suggesting we take a walk around the block. Ari was always a bit self-conscious about his weight, so he was happy to seize the chance for some exercise. It gave us the perfect excuse to step away from the group. When we were a safe distance from the house, I turned to him, my voice low. Ari, I need to talk to you about something unusual. Something that's been bothering me. His brow furrowed with concern. What is it? I hesitated, unsure how to phrase what I was about to say. Have you ever noticed anything strange about Hannah? Or Amy? He tilted his head, clearly puzzled. What do you mean by strange? You know, little things, I said, choosing my words carefully. Like moments where they don't quite seem like themselves. He paused for a moment, clearly considering my question. Well, sure, he admitted. But doesn't everyone have off days? I nodded, but my mind was racing. If Ari had noticed even subtle inconsistencies, could that mean he was grappling with the same doubts I was? And if he was, then what did that say about the lives we were all living? Ari, I began hesitantly as we strolled down the quiet street, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about something personal for a couple of minutes. Is that okay? He glanced over at me, his expression curious but open. Of course, Scott. What's the matter? I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain steady. First, let's agree that this conversation stays just between us. I don't want Molly, Hannah, Amy, or Ted, for that matter, finding out. Ari's brow furrowed, but he nodded. You've got my word. What's going on? I hesitated for a moment, trying to arrange my thoughts. Then, with what I hoped was a calm, neutral tone to mask the turmoil inside, I said, Ari, tell me something. Has it always been this way? I mean, from the very beginning of your marriage. He thought about it for a moment, his face shadowed with a hint of unease. Almost always, he admitted finally. Hannah and I have this routine. I guess you could call it a little game we play. I nodded, encouraging him to continue while silently bracing myself. You know how girls tend to gather in the kitchen in the evenings? He asked. Yeah, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Well, by the time she comes back from that, I'm usually already in bed, reading or watching TV, Ari continued. When she climbs into bed, there's this moment, like a reset. We just pick up where we left off, no matter how the day went. It's comforting, I guess. I nodded along, trying to focus, but my mind was already racing. My thoughts drifted far away, to a cold and desolate place where anger and suspicion were battling for control. Ari kept talking, unaware of the storm brewing inside me, but I only half heard his words. My mind was stuck replaying every interaction, every moment, trying to untangle what was real and what might have been a lie. By the time we returned to the barbecue, I was seething inside, though I wore a disappointed expression to mask the rage bubbling beneath the surface. I managed to get through the rest of the afternoon without breaking down. People noticed I was quieter than usual, but no one pushed me for an explanation. I was determined to last another day, to think carefully before confronting anyone. That evening, after we left Ted and Amy's house, I suggested taking Molly out for dinner. How about Indian food? I asked with forced cheerfulness, knowing it was her favorite. She smiled, and we spent the evening in what I can only describe as a carefully constructed performance. I tried to be the picture of a cheerful companion, even though every bite of food felt like swallowing sand. Around 10 p.m., we returned home. Molly disappeared into the bathroom, and I climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling as I tried to piece together my next steps. I knew I couldn't keep pretending much longer. The weight of what I'd overheard and the suspicions swirling in my mind were becoming unbearable. A few minutes later, I heard the bathroom door open, and Molly's familiar voice called out softly, "Hey, honey." I turned to face her, forcing a smile as she slipped into bed beside me. Her presence, usually a source of comfort, now filled me with unease. I couldn't shake the image of the conversations I'd overheard, couldn't stop wondering if the woman lying next to me was the one I'd shared my life with, or if it was all just another carefully orchestrated lie. I smiled at Molly as she climbed into bed and said, "Let's finish tonight the way we ended yesterday." That was amazing. She gave me a hesitant look, her expression wary. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked cautiously. "Don't you remember?" I said with a playful grin. "You came downstairs with this sparkle in your eyes and said something like, 'So, big boy, how do you want me tonight?' It was so hot." And I said, "Well, giving my manhood some credit might be a good idea." Molly froze, her wariness deepening. For a moment, I thought I'd gone too far. Then, with a forced smile, she replied, "Oh, that. Yeah, I guess I was feeling a little wild yesterday." But something about her tone was off. It lacked the warmth and humor I usually heard in her voice. She seemed to have a harder time getting into the mood, and my usual affectionate gestures, stroking her hair, kissing her neck, weren't having their usual effect. She was distant, unresponsive. I pulled back and studied her face. "Is everything okay, honey?" I asked, trying to sound as innocent as possible. "It feels like you're not really here with me tonight." She caught my gaze and sighed. "Sorry, Scott. I guess I'm just a little tired. And my stomach is upset, probably because of the spicy food. Let's make love, but please don't expect me to be wild and crazy again tonight, okay?" I forced a smile. "Of course. Whatever you want." But even as I said it, doubt was creeping in. Something was wrong. The next evening, during a family dinner at our house, the tension between Molly and her sisters was palpable. Molly had been quiet and distracted all day, but her demeanor shifted dramatically during the meal. About 10 minutes in, she looked pointedly at Hannah and said, "Hannah, I need to powder my nose. Could you join me?" Without waiting for a reply, she stood up and left the table, her expression dark and stormy. Hannah followed, looking slightly bewildered. Several minutes passed before they returned, and when they did, both looked pale and nervous. They fumbled with their drinks, lost track of conversations, and avoided looking in my direction. Their unease was so obvious that even Ted and Ari seemed to notice. I pretended not to, plastering a cheerful facade as I shared funny stories about work and our upcoming vacation plans. But inside, I was steeling myself for what was to come. The evening ended awkwardly, with neither Amy nor Hannah meeting my eyes as they hugged me goodbye. Molly barely said a word as we cleaned up the kitchen together, and her responses to my attempts at light-hearted banter were short and strained. She was terrified, I could see it in her every movement. I headed upstairs, determined to sort through my thoughts before confronting her. But just a few minutes later, Molly appeared in the bedroom doorway, her face streaked with tears and makeup running down her cheeks. She looked utterly broken. "Honey. Amy and Hannah are here. They want to talk to you. Can you come down, please?" I stared at her for a long moment, unsure whether I felt anger or pity. For just a second, I even felt sorry for her. "Yes," I said at last, turning away. "I'll be down in a minute." Before leaving the room, I grabbed a small digital voice recorder I'd hidden in my nightstand. If this conversation was going where I thought it might, I wanted evidence. Downstairs, the three of them sat in a row, visibly uncomfortable. Molly was sobbing uncontrollably, while Amy and Hannah wore expressions of deep regret. The room was heavy with tension, the silence punctuated only by Molly's choked cries. "I'll make this simple," I said, my voice cold. "Over the past 3 nights, each of you has been in my bed. Am I wrong?" A long silence followed. Molly broke into louder sobs, burying her face in her hands. Amy and Hannah exchanged guilty glances before nodding reluctantly. I pretended to rise from my seat. "I need to pack my things," I said. "Wait!" Molly cried, scrambling to her feet. "Please, Scott. Let me explain. Just give me a chance to make you understand." I wanted to shout, to tell her it was too late for explanations. But what I really wanted, what I needed, was to hear her twisted reasoning. Amy finally spoke, her voice trembling. "It was stupid, Scott. We all understand that now. You're probably furious, and you have every right to be. But please, give Molly a chance. She loves you so much." "Loves me?" I said bitterly. "Really? Is that why this happened? So, Amy, you were with me one night, Molly was with Ari another. Tell me, how does love with me compare to good old Ted?" Amy's face turned ghostly white, and her jaw dropped in shock. She looked like she wanted to disappear. None of them had an answer for me, and I sat back, waiting for the truth, or whatever twisted version of it, they were ready to share. I didn't. "I don't know, Scott," Molly stammered through her sobs. "It wasn't like that. I cut her off, my voice cold and firm. "You don't know? Really? Because I'd like to remind you that I gave you access to every part of me, my heart, my trust, and you decided to gamble it all. So don't tell me you don't know." I paused, looking at each of them, their faces etched with guilt. Molly was sobbing uncontrollably, her sisters grimly silent. My patience was nearing its end, but I wanted the truth, every last painful word of it. "You have one more chance," I said, my voice low but commanding. "One more try to tell me the truth. And this time, I want to hear it from Molly. How long have you been cheating on me with each of their husbands?" Molly's red-rimmed eyes met mine, pleading silently for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. I waited. The silence was suffocating until she finally broke it, her voice shaking. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Scott, we never meant for it to hurt you. It wasn't about the way we love each other," she faltered, her words disjointed. "It wasn't even about pregnancy." I stared at her, every muscle in my body tense. "Do you think I don't know?" I spat. "Do you think I didn't figure it out? My dear, devoted wife, were you really going to have Ted's child because you thought I wasn't up to the task?" Her face went pale as she gasped, "No, Scott." She stood and tried to hug me, her hands outstretched, but I stepped back sharply. "Don't touch me," I snapped. "You've betrayed me in every way imaginable." Molly stumbled, her heel catching on the edge of the refrigerator, and fell back. Her sisters rushed to help her, but neither dared look at me. I glared at all three of them, disgusted and overwhelmed. I didn't want to believe what was happening. I wanted to wake up from this nightmare. The anger boiling in my chest erupted. "Tell me the truth," I roared, turning to Amy. "How long have you been part of this twisted charade? How does love with me compare to love with good old Ted?" Amy looked as if I'd slapped her. She froze, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find words. Her face flushed with shame, and her eyes filled with tears. Molly cried harder, unable to form coherent words, while Hannah looked at the floor, silent and resigned. I turned to leave the room. "I need to pack my things," I muttered. "Wait." Molly's voice cracked as she scrambled after me. Please, Scott. Let me explain. Just, give me a chance to make you understand. I stopped in my tracks, my fists clenched at my sides. Fine, I said, my voice laced with venom. You want a chance? Then explain to me why this happened. Amy spoke up, her voice trembling. Scott, we never meant for things to go this far. It started as, I don't even know what to call it. A joke. A way to relive the bond we had growing up. It was stupid, and we all understand that now. You have every right to be angry. Angry? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You think angry even begins to describe this? Do you have any idea what you've done? Amy's lip quivered, but she pressed on. Please, Scott. Give Molly a chance. She loves you so much. I turned to Molly, my voice rising. Loves me? Is that what this is? Love? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like betrayal. She sank to her knees, sobbing. Scott, I don't want them. I don't need my sisters. I need you. Please, please don't leave me. Her words were a knife to my chest, but I couldn't ignore what had happened. Molly, I said quietly, my voice steady with finality, when we got married, I believed we were a team. That I came first in your life, just as you came first in mine. But you put your sisters above me. You put love with Ari above me. You were even willing to have Ted's child without saying a word to me. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, but I didn't stop. You've had your chance, Molly. You can have your sisters, but you won't have me. I stood and turned to leave, my decision made. Scott, no, she cried, but her words didn't stop me. In the months that followed, I filed for divorce and began piecing my life back together. Ted and I stayed in contact, sharing our mutual devastation, while Ari chose to stay with Hannah. He claimed he was less affected, though he laid down strict boundaries. Hannah was forced to grow her hair out, Ari's way of ensuring she could never switch places with her sisters again. It was a strange and painful resolution, but at least I was free.